I remember the exact moment my son looked me dead in the eye and said, "Mom, either you pay my wife $80,000, or consider yourself cut off." Those words pierced me deeper than any cold winter wind on Brooklyn's cracked sidewalks. The Christmas tree lights blurred through my tears as I realized my own child had just put a price tag on our relationship. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every morning, I wake up in my small Manhattan apartment on the Upper West Side, where the rent eats up most of my Social Security check. The faint smell of burnt coffee mingles with the buzz of subway trains beyond my third-floor window. The walls are lined with old photographs, some faded, some still sharp with memory. Photos of my son Michael when he was little, chubby-cheeked and laughing on the swings at Central Park. Pictures of my late husband Robert, a quiet man who drove the subway for 37 years and taught me to stand tall even when the world seemed stacked against us. Yet now, those pictures feel like relics from another life, symbols of a happier version of myself I hardly recognize anymore. The woman in those photos had hope in her eyes. She believed family meant something sacred. She trusted that love wasn't something you had to buy. This past Christmas was supposed to be different. I had saved every penny for months, shopping at 3 different grocery stores to find the best deals. I prepared my famous roasted turkey, the one Robert always said was better than his mother's. I made mashed potatoes from scratch, green bean casserole with those crispy onions on top, and even splurged on real cranberry sauce instead of the canned stuff. The very dishes my family used to beg me to make. But instead of warmth and laughter filling my tiny dining room, that Christmas dinner was cold and hostile. The air felt thick with tension, like the humidity before a summer thunderstorm hits Manhattan. Michael arrived 2 hours late, designer suitcase in hand, wearing a coat that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in 3 months. His wife Cynthia followed behind him, her heels clicking against my worn hardwood floors like a countdown timer. Their eyes weren't filled with joy to see me, they were sharp and calculating, filled with expectation. When Michael finally spoke those devastating words, the world didn't just tilt. It shattered completely. But let me take you back to the beginning, because this story didn't start on Christmas Day. It began years ago, with a mother's love and the slow, painful realization that some people see kindness as weakness. I gave my whole life to that family. Every dollar, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, it all went to them. I remember the phone call 3 years ago when Michael lost his marketing job at that firm in Midtown. His voice was shaky, desperate. "Mom, I don't know what we're going to do. The rent on our Long Island house is due, and Cynthia's pregnant with our second child." Without hesitation, I drove out to Chase Bank on 86th Street and withdrew $15,000 from my retirement fund. The bank teller, a kind woman named Rosa who'd helped me for years, looked concerned. "Mrs. Peterson, are you sure about this withdrawal? It's a significant amount." I brushed off her worry with a smile. "It's for my family. They need me." That $15,000 became $25,000 when little Emma needed surgery for her tonsils. Then it became $40,000 when their house needed a new roof. Each time, Michael promised it was the last time. Each time, his voice carried that same desperate edge that tugged at my heartstrings. "This is your last loan, Mom," he said during our last conversation before Christmas, his tone tight with what I thought was embarrassment. I didn't complain. I never complained. Instead, I took on extra shifts at Murphy's Diner on the corner of 79th and Columbus, where the smell of bacon grease clung to my uniform and my feet ached from standing on the cracked linoleum floors for 12 hours straight. I worked double shifts, triple shifts sometimes, just to make sure Michael's little family had everything they needed. When Cynthia called me crying about their mounting credit card debts I later learned were from shopping sprees at Bergdorf Goodman and weekend trips to the Hamptons, I drove 2 hours down to their house with bags of groceries and my grandmother's homemade soup. I forgave their lies. I forgave the half-truths. I forgave the unreturned calls that stretched for weeks. When I'd finally reach Michael, his voice would be distant, distracted. "Sorry, Mom, we've been busy. You know how it is with the kids and work and everything." But I didn't know. Because they never told me about their lives anymore. I learned about my granddaughter's first day of school from a Facebook post. I found out about my grandson's baseball tournament from a neighbor who saw them at the field. I existed on the periphery of their lives, useful only when they needed something. "You don't understand the pressure we're under," Michael once snapped when I gently questioned why he needed another $5,000 just 3 weeks after the last payment. "This city is expensive, Mom. Everything costs money, the good schools, the activities for the kids, keeping up with our social circle. You wouldn't understand." The silence that followed his words was colder than the February wind whipping through the streets of Manhattan. It was always cold silences or sharp words when I dared to ask why I seemed to be the only one giving in this relationship. I started to doubt myself. Was I being unreasonable? Was I just a walking ATM to them, a bank that never said no? The doubts grew like shadows in my apartment as the sun set earlier each winter day. But like the city around me, I pretended to be stronger than I felt. I smiled when they called asking for money. I said yes when every fiber of my being wanted to ask them to stand on their own 2 feet. The questions haunted my sleepless nights. Why was I the only one sacrificing? Why didn't they ever ask how I was doing? When was the last time they visited just to see me, not because they needed something? But I pushed those thoughts away. Family is family, I told myself. This is what mothers do. We give until it hurts, and then we give some more. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever wondered whether you're being taken advantage of by the people who should love you most, stay with me. Because what happened next opened my eyes in ways I never expected. The microaggressions started small, like paper cuts that don't seem like much until you realize you're bleeding from 1,000 tiny wounds. My 70th birthday came and went without so much as a phone call from Michael or Cynthia. When I mentioned it during our next conversation, Cynthia laughed. Oh, we're so scattered these days. You know how busy young families are. Besides, birthdays aren't that important when you're your age, are they? Christmas cards I sent came back marked, returned to sender. When I asked Michael about it, he said they'd moved but forgot to give me their new address. It took me 6 months to track down where they lived, the same house I'd been visiting for years, the same address I'd been sending money to. My arthritis flared up badly last spring, the kind of pain that shoots through your joints like lightning. I called Michael, hoping maybe he could drive me to my doctor's appointment in Queens. Mom, I can't just drop everything. I have work, and Cynthia has her yoga class. Can't you take an Uber? 87 years old, barely able to grip a coffee cup some mornings, and they expected me to navigate the city alone. I took 3 different subway lines to get to that appointment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the Metro card. The doctor, a patient man named Dr. Martinez who'd treated my husband years before, took one look at me and asked, Mrs. Peterson, do you have anyone helping you at home? Family nearby? I lied and said yes. I was too ashamed to admit that my son, who lived just an hour away, couldn't be bothered to help his aging mother get medical care. But the real breaking point came on a rainy afternoon in November. I was organizing my mail when I found a stack of bills that had been mistakenly delivered to my address. They were addressed to Cynthia, forwarded from some previous address. My hands trembled as I looked through them, not trying to snoop, just gathering them to send along. What I saw made my stomach drop. Unpaid medical bills for cosmetic procedures. Overdue credit card statements from luxury stores like Tiffany & Company and Saks Fifth Avenue. Bills for a country club membership, for tennis lessons, for a personal trainer. Line after line of charges for things I could never afford, would never even dream of buying. The final statement showed a balance of over $80,000 in credit card debt. $80,000 they'd accumulated while crying poverty to me, while taking my retirement money, while making me feel guilty for questioning their constant need for financial help. I sat in my small kitchen, the bills spread across the table like evidence in a crime scene. My hands shook so violently that the coffee cup slipped through my fingers and shattered against the linoleum floor. The sound echoed through my apartment like a gunshot. Tears fell silently at first, then in torrents, years of suppressed hurt and anger pouring out of me. I cried for every birthday they'd forgotten. I cried for every time they'd made me feel like a burden. I cried for my husband Robert, who would have known what to do, who would have protected me from this betrayal. For the first time in my life, I thought seriously about saying no. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like a language I'd never learned to speak. But loneliness clawed at me, whispering its familiar refrain. What if they cut me off completely? What if I never saw my grandchildren again? What if saying no meant dying alone in this apartment, with only the city noise for company? So I did what I always did. I cleaned up the broken cup, put the bills in an envelope, and pretended I'd never seen them. I packed away the family photos into a cardboard box, closed the blinds against the gray November sky, and stared long into the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had eyes I barely recognized, hollow, exhausted, aching with a pain that went deeper than arthritis, deeper than loneliness. She looked like a ghost of herself, a person who'd given away so much of her soul that there was barely anything left. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. But I didn't know it yet. Have you ever looked in the mirror and not recognized yourself? Have you ever wondered if the people who claim to love you actually see you as a person, or just as a resource to be used up? Hold on to that feeling, because it's about to get much worse before it gets better. When I finally worked up the courage to confront Michael about what I'd discovered, his reaction was swift and brutal. I'd rehearsed the conversation in my head for days, trying to find the gentlest way to ask why he needed my money when he was spending thousands on luxury items. Michael, honey, I began carefully during our phone call. I accidentally received some of Cynthia's mail, and I couldn't help but notice, you went through our private mail? His voice cut through my words like ice. Mom, that's completely inappropriate. And frankly, it's a little paranoid. Are you having mental issues? Maybe we should talk about getting you some help. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Mental issues? I was sharper than people half my age, still balancing my checkbook to the penny, still reading the New York Times cover to cover every morning. But suddenly, I was the one with problems for noticing their deception. Cynthia's voice joined the call, sugary sweet but with steel underneath. Mrs. Peterson, I'm really disappointed that you'd violate our privacy like that. We've been under so much stress, and now this? It feels like you don't trust us after everything we've been through together. She was twisting the narrative, making me the villain in my own story. According to them, I was the ungrateful mother, the paranoid old lady who didn't understand the pressures of modern life in New York. They painted me as selfish for questioning where my retirement money was going, unreasonable for wanting transparency in our financial relationship. My daughter Valerie, when she heard their version of events, just sighed deeply over the phone. Mom, maybe you should mind your own business. Michael and Cynthia are adults. They can handle their own finances. But Valerie, I tried to explain, I've given them over $60,000 in the past 3 years, and that was your choice, she interrupted. Nobody forced you to do that. If you didn't want to help them, you should have said no from the beginning. The conversation ended with Valerie avoiding my calls for weeks. I'd lost not just Michael's respect, but apparently my daughter's as well. The isolation felt like being buried alive, surrounded by the noise and energy of New York City but completely cut off from the people who were supposed to matter most. But then there was Lena Rodriguez, my neighbor from the 4th floor. She was a retired elementary school teacher, a widow like me who'd moved to Manhattan after her husband passed. Every Tuesday, she'd knock on my door with fresh Italian bread from the bakery on Amsterdam Avenue. Dorothy, she said one afternoon, settling into my worn armchair with her usual cup of tea, you look like you haven't slept in weeks. What's troubling you, Mija? Something about Lena's genuine warmth broke through my defenses. The whole story poured out, the money, the lies, the credit card bills, the way my family made me feel like I was losing my mind for noticing their deception. Lena listened without judgment, her dark eyes filled with understanding. When I finished, she reached across and took my hands in hers. Dorothy, I taught school for 40 years. I've seen every kind of manipulation, every kind of emotional blackmail that exists. What your family is doing to you, that's not love. That's financial abuse, pure and simple. Financial abuse? I'd never heard the term before, but it fit like a key in a lock. Lena explained how abusers isolate their victims, make them doubt their own perceptions, paint them as the problem when they dare to ask questions. You're not crazy, Lena said firmly. You're not ungrateful. You're being used by people who should be protecting you. And until you stand up for yourself, it's only going to get worse. Her words were like a small beacon of light in the dark tunnel I'd been living in. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone. Someone saw me as a person worth defending, worth protecting. That conversation with Lena planted a seed of courage I didn't even know existed. But courage doesn't bloom overnight, especially when you've spent years being told you're worthless except for what you can provide. The seed would need time to grow. And unfortunately, things were about to get much worse before they got better. Are you starting to see the pattern here? The way manipulative people operate? How they make you doubt your own reality while they take advantage of your love. If this sounds familiar, please know you're not alone. And please know that what happened next might help you find your own strength. The next few months felt like walking through quicksand. Every time I tried to assert myself, to ask reasonable questions about where my money was going, the family would close ranks against me. Michael's calls became shorter and more formal. Cynthia stopped pretending to be friendly altogether. The worst part was how they weaponized my grandchildren against me. Emma, who used to run to hug me whenever I visited, suddenly seemed shy and distant. When I asked her about school, she'd shrug and look to her parents for permission to answer. Grandma's been asking a lot of questions lately, I heard Cynthia whisper to Emma one afternoon. Sometimes grown-ups get confused when they get older. Maybe we should give Grandma some space. Confused. There was that word again, the subtle suggestion that I was losing my mental faculties. It was a way to dismiss anything I said, to make my concerns seem like the ramblings of a senile old woman. The financial requests kept coming, but now they carried an edge of resentment. Mom, we need $3,000 for Emma's private school tuition. I guess we could pull her out and send her to public school if you can't help us anymore. The guilt was laid on thick, the implication clear, any problems my grandchildren faced would be my fault for being selfish with my money. I gave them the $3,000, then another $2,000 for little Jake's medical bills, then $1,500 for car repairs. Each payment felt like I was buying another few weeks of their tolerance, purchasing the right to remain part of my own family. But I was slowly going broke. My savings account, built up over decades of careful budgeting and Robert's pension contributions, was dwindling rapidly. I started shopping at discount grocery stores, buying generic brands, skipping meals to make my food budget stretch. I canceled my cable TV subscription, switched to the cheapest cell phone plan, wore the same 3 sweaters throughout the winter because I couldn't afford new clothes. Meanwhile, Michael's Facebook post showed family vacations to Martha's Vineyard, expensive dinners at trendy Manhattan restaurants, pictures of Cynthia wearing jewelry I knew I'd indirectly paid for with my retirement funds. The cognitive dissonance was making me feel crazy. How could they be taking family trips while telling me they couldn't afford basic necessities? How could they eat at restaurants that charged $30 for a hamburger while crying poverty? I tried talking to Valerie again, hoping she'd see reason. Sweetheart, I'm worried about Michael and Cynthia. They keep asking for money, but their lifestyle seems— Mom, stop, Valerie cut me off. You're becoming obsessed with their business. It's not healthy. Maybe you should talk to someone. Dr. Martinez referred some of his older patients to a therapist who specializes in age-related anxiety. Age-related anxiety. Another subtle way of saying I was losing my grip on reality. Even my own daughter was gaslighting me, making me doubt my own perceptions. I started keeping a notebook, writing down every financial request, every payment, every promise that this would be the last time. The numbers were staggering, over $70,000 in 3 years. Enough money to buy a small house in some parts of the country. Enough to live comfortably for several years. But more devastating than the money was the emotional toll. I felt like a ghost in my own life, visible only when they needed something, invisible when they were celebrating milestones or sharing good news. They'd exclude me from birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, holiday celebrations, then show up at my door with demands for cash. The breaking point came in November, just before Thanksgiving. I was supposed to host dinner for the whole family, my traditional turkey with all the trimmings. I'd been planning for weeks, saving money for the groceries, cleaning every corner of my small apartment. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Michael called with his usual casual cruelty. Mom, change of plans. We're not going to make it for Thanksgiving. Cynthia's parents invited us to their place in Connecticut. They have a much bigger house, and honestly, it's more convenient for everyone. More convenient for everyone except me, the woman who'd been cooking Thanksgiving dinner for this family for over 40 years. The woman who'd already bought the turkey, already prepared the side dishes that could be made ahead of time. But Michael, I started. Sorry, Mom. Plans change. You understand. He hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by enough food for 8 people, knowing I'd be eating Thanksgiving dinner alone. The turkey seemed to mock me from the refrigerator, a 20-pound reminder of how little I mattered to my own family. That's when I finally understood what Lena had been trying to tell me. This wasn't love. This wasn't even basic human decency. This was systematic emotional abuse, designed to keep me compliant and useful while denying me the respect and dignity every person deserves. I called Lena and asked if she'd like to share Thanksgiving dinner with me. She came down with a bottle of wine and stories about her own grandchildren, who lived in California but called her every week just to check in. Dorothy, she said as we sat at my small table, sharing a meal that was meant for a much larger family, you're worth so much more than this. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not what you can provide. Those words echoed in my mind as we cleaned up the dishes together. For the first time in years, I'd enjoyed a holiday meal. Not because the food was perfect, but because I was with someone who genuinely cared about my well-being. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. But first, my family would show me exactly how little regard they had for me as a human being. Do you see how abuse works? How it starts small and builds gradually until you can't trust your own perceptions anymore. If you're recognizing these patterns in your own life, keep listening. Because what happened next might give you the courage to change your own story. Christmas arrived like a storm I could feel building on the horizon. Despite their cruelty at Thanksgiving, Michael and Cynthia announced they'd be coming for Christmas dinner after all. Not because they wanted to spend time with me, but because they needed something. I could hear it in Michael's voice when he called. Mom, we'll be there Christmas Day around 2 o'clock. Make sure you have everything ready, you know how picky the kids can be about food. No, how are you doing, or what can we bring, or thank you for hosting. Just demands and expectations, as if I were the hired help rather than the family matriarch. I spent the week before Christmas cooking and cleaning, using the last of my household money to buy ingredients for their favorite dishes. I polished the silverware Robert's mother had given us as a wedding gift, set the table with the good china that only came out for special occasions. I even bought presents for the children, modest gifts I could barely afford, but I wrapped them carefully and put them under the small artificial tree I'd managed to squeeze into my living room corner. They arrived 2 hours late, as I mentioned before. Michael looked around my apartment with barely concealed disdain, as if he were noticing for the first time how small and shabby it had become. Cynthia kept checking her phone, sighing dramatically whenever she had to put it down. The children, Emma and Jake, seemed different. More distant than usual, less spontaneous. They accepted my hugs politely but without enthusiasm, as if they'd been coached on how to behave around their increasingly irrelevant grandmother. Dinner was a tense affair. Michael picked at his food, which he'd once claimed was his favorite meal in the world. Cynthia made several comments about how rich the gravy was, how much butter I'd used in the mashed potatoes, how she was trying to watch her figure. "The kids are used to organic everything now," she said, pushing vegetables around her plate. "We've really elevated our standards since we started shopping at Whole Foods." Whole Foods. With money I'd given them 4 basic necessities. After dinner, as I was clearing the table and trying to maintain some semblance of holiday cheer, Michael finally revealed the real reason for their visit. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of barely controlled desperation mixed with entitlement. "Cynthia and I have been discussing our situation, and we've reached a point where we need your help with something bigger." I paused in stacking dishes, a cold dread settling in my stomach. "What kind of help, Michael?" Cynthia straightened in her chair, suddenly very focused on the conversation. This was clearly a planned presentation, rehearsed and coordinated. "We've made some investments that haven't panned out the way we expected," Michael continued. "Stock market volatility, you know how it is. Our financial advisor suggested some cryptocurrency investments that seemed like sure things, but Bitcoin took a major hit last quarter. I knew nothing about stocks or cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, but I knew my son well enough to recognize a lie when I heard one. This wasn't about failed investments. This was about their out-of-control spending, their refusal to live within their means, their assumption that I would always be there to bail them out. "We need $80,000, Cynthia said bluntly, dropping the pretense of Michael doing all the talking. "It's not negotiable. If we don't pay off our debts by the end of January, we could lose the house. The kids would have to change schools. Emma's in the middle of her junior year. Do you want to be responsible for disrupting her education?" $80,000. More money than I'd ever seen in one place, more than Robert and I had saved in our entire marriage. Money I simply didn't have, even if I liquidated every asset I owned. "I don't have that kind of money," I said quietly, my hands trembling as I set down the plates. Michael's face darkened. "Don't lie to us, Mom. We know you have Dad's life insurance money, his pension, your retirement funds. You've been sitting on a fortune for years while we've been struggling to make ends meet." A fortune. He called my modest savings, money I'd need to survive my remaining years, to pay for medical care, to maintain some shred of dignity in my old age, a fortune that I was selfishly hoarding. "Michael, that money has to last me for the rest of my life. I'm 87 years old. I can't work anymore." You need to help your family," Cynthia interrupted. "That's what mothers do. That's what grandmothers do. They sacrifice for the next generation." The word sacrifice hit me like a slap. I'd been sacrificing for them my entire adult life. I'd sacrificed my own comfort, my own security, my own peace of mind. What more did they want from me? "I've already given you over $70,000 in the past 3 years, I said, finding some strength in my voice. "That's not enough?" Michael's expression turned cold, calculating. This was the moment I'd been dreading, the moment when the mask finally came off completely. "Mom, let me be very clear about something. Either you pay Cynthia $80,000 by the end of January, or consider yourself cut off from this family. No more visits, no more phone calls, no more contact with your grandchildren. You'll be completely alone, just like you apparently want to be." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic on the street below. Emma and Jake had stopped playing in the living room. I realized they could hear every word of this devastating conversation. Those words, "consider yourself cut off," echoed in the small dining room like a death sentence. My own son, the little boy I'd rocked to sleep countless times, had just threatened to erase me from existence unless I bankrupted myself to solve problems he'd created. I looked around the table at these people I'd loved and sacrificed for my entire adult life. Cynthia sat with her arms crossed, looking impatient, as if this conversation was merely an inconvenience keeping her from more important things. Michael stared at me with cold eyes that held no trace of the sweet child he'd once been. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was Lena's voice echoing in my memory, reminding me that I deserved better. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of years of disrespect finally reaching a breaking point. Maybe it was simply that I had nothing left to lose. "Let me understand this correctly," I said slowly, my voice steadier than I felt. "You're giving me an ultimatum. Pay you $80,000, or you'll cut me out of your lives completely." "That's right," Michael said without hesitation. "It's your choice, Mom. Family or selfishness. Your grandchildren or your bank account." I stood up from the table, my legs shaky but my resolve growing stronger with each passing second. Then I guess you'd better try cutting me off, Michael. Because I don't have $80,000 to give you, and even if I did, I wouldn't reward this kind of blackmail. The shocked silence that followed my words was almost worth the pain of speaking them. For a moment, Michael's confident facade cracked, revealing something like panic underneath. Mom, you don't mean that, he said, his voice losing some of its edge. You're upset. We're all upset. Let's just calm down and figure this out like adults. But I was done figuring things out. I was done being reasonable while they were cruel. I was done sacrificing my dignity for people who saw me as nothing more than a source of cash. I think you should leave now, I said quietly. Take your children and go home to your house that I helped pay for, with your expensive car that I helped finance. They left in a flurry of anger and threats. Michael promised this wasn't over. Cynthia muttered something about ungrateful old women. The children looked confused and scared, but they followed their parents out of my apartment and, I thought, out of my life forever. I spent that night sitting by my window, looking out at the city lights and wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Had I just chosen pride over family? Would I really never see my grandchildren again? But for the first time in years, despite the loneliness and fear, I also felt something else, relief. The constant anxiety of waiting for their next demand was gone. The crushing weight of their disappointment and manipulation had lifted. I'd called their bluff. Now I'd find out what that really meant. Have you ever reached a moment where you simply couldn't take another step down the path of self-destruction? Where standing up for yourself felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary? That Christmas night changed everything for me, but the real test was still to come. If you're still with me, if this story is resonating with something in your own life, I want you to know that what happened next surprised even me. Sometimes when we find the courage to say no, we discover strength we never knew we had. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Michael and a string of increasingly frantic text messages. The confident man who delivered his ultimatum was now in full panic mode. Mom, call me back immediately. We need to talk about this. You're making a huge mistake. Think about Emma and Jake. Cynthia is beside herself. You're destroying this family. Fine. Have it your way. Don't expect to hear from us again. I deleted the messages without responding. For the first time in years, I had a plan that didn't involve giving away money I couldn't spare to people who wouldn't appreciate it. I called Lena first. She came downstairs with coffee and pastries, her presence a steadying force in the chaos of my emotions. How do you feel? She asked simply. Terrified, I admitted. But also, lighter somehow. Is that terrible? Should I feel guilty for standing up to them? Dorothy, you should feel proud. What you did took incredible courage. Most people in your situation would have given in, would have found a way to scrape together that money. Lena was right. I probably could have found ways to get the $80,000. I could have taken out a reverse mortgage on my apartment, borrowed against my life insurance policy, liquidated every investment Robert and I had made over the years. I could have impoverished myself completely to meet their demands. But then what? There would be another crisis in 6 months, another emergency requiring my intervention. I'd be trapped in an endless cycle of financial abuse until I had nothing left to give, and then they'd discard me anyway. That afternoon, I took the subway down to a legal aid office in Lower Manhattan. The lawyer, a sharp young woman named Sarah Chen, listened to my story with growing outrage. Mrs. Peterson, what you're describing is financial elder abuse. It's more common than you might think, and unfortunately, it often involves family members who exploit their older relatives' love and fear of abandonment. She helped me set up protections for my remaining assets, creating legal barriers that would prevent anyone from accessing my accounts or pressuring me into major financial decisions. For the first time in years, my money felt truly mine again. I also made an appointment with Dr. Martinez, asking him to document my mental state for the record. I wasn't losing my mind, as my family had suggested. I was an intelligent woman who'd been systematically manipulated and gaslit by people who should have been protecting me. Your cognitive function is excellent for someone your age, Dr. Martinez confirmed after a series of tests. You're sharp, alert, and making rational decisions to protect yourself. That takes wisdom and strength, not mental decline. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I cooked dinner just for myself. A small piece of salmon, some steamed vegetables, a glass of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, listening to classical music on my old radio. It was the first peaceful meal I'd had in my own home in years. The next few days brought a barrage of attempted contact from Michael and Cynthia. They tried calling from different numbers, sending messages through Valerie, even having little Emma call and ask why I didn't want to see her anymore. That last manipulation nearly broke my resolve. Hearing my granddaughter's confused voice asking if she'd done something wrong almost sent me running back to their arms with my checkbook in hand. But I remembered Sarah Chen's words: abusers often use children as emotional weapons. They'll make those children feel responsible for adult conflicts to manipulate you into compliance. I wrote Emma a letter instead, explaining in terms an 11-year-old could understand that sometimes adults make choices that seem confusing but are necessary for everyone's well-being. I told her I loved her and always would, but that I couldn't be part of her life right now because her parents had asked me to do something that wasn't healthy for any of us. I sealed the letter and put it in my desk drawer. Maybe someday I'd be able to give it to her. Maybe someday she'd understand. 2 weeks after Christmas, the phone call stopped. The text messages ended. The silence felt both liberating and devastating. I'd won my independence, but at the cost of losing my entire family. Or so I thought. Because what happened next taught me something important about the nature of manipulative people. They don't give up easily, and they certainly don't respect boundaries unless those boundaries are enforced with absolute consistency. But I was about to discover I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. And sometimes, when you stop playing by someone else's rules, you find out what you're truly capable of. Are you wondering how this story ends? Are you hoping I found a way to reconcile with my family while still maintaining my dignity? Keep listening, because the journey toward self-respect is rarely straightforward, and my family had one more devastating surprise in store for me. February arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes New York feel like the loneliest place on earth. I'd been living in my newfound independence for 6 weeks, getting used to the strange quiet of not waiting for the phone to ring with another financial crisis. I started small routines that belonged entirely to me. Tuesday morning coffee with Lena had become sacred. I'd joined a book club at the local library, where retired teachers and librarians discussed novels I'd never had time to read when I was busy solving everyone else's problems. For the first time since Robert died, I was learning who Dorothy Peterson was when she wasn't defined by other people's needs. But Michael and Cynthia weren't done with me yet. The attack came through social media, a platform I barely understood but that Valerie had helped me set up years earlier to see pictures of my grandchildren. Michael created a family group chat that included not just immediate family, but cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends, anyone who'd ever known our family. The message, posted for everyone to see, was a masterpiece of manipulation. It is with great sadness that I have to share this publicly, but my mother has chosen money over family. Despite our desperate financial situation, Emma's medical bills, potential foreclosure on our home, Jake's special education needs, she has refused to help us when we need her most. We've tried everything to reason with her, but she's become increasingly paranoid and hostile. We're worried about her mental state, but she won't accept help from any of us. If anyone has advice on how to deal with elderly relatives who've become irrational and cruel, please reach out privately. We love her, but we can't continue to expose our children to this toxic behavior. I stared at the screen, reading and rereading those devastating lies. Emma's medical bills, for cosmetic braces that weren't covered by insurance because they were purely aesthetic. Foreclosure threats, on a house they could easily afford if they stopped taking vacations and shopping at luxury stores. Jake's special education needs, he was a perfectly normal child who attended an expensive private school by choice, not necessity. But the broader family didn't know these details. All they saw was a sad story about an ungrateful mother abandoning her son's family in their hour of need. The responses came quickly: "So sorry you're going through this, Michael. Elderly parents can be so difficult. Have you considered getting her evaluated for dementia? That kind of paranoia is often a sign. Family should always come first. I can't imagine choosing money over grandchildren. Maybe it's time to consider guardianship options if she's not mentally competent anymore." Guardianship. They were publicly discussing taking away my legal rights, painting me as mentally incompetent because I'd refused to bankrupt myself for their benefit. My first instinct was to defend myself, to post my own message explaining the years of financial abuse, the luxury spending, the manipulation. But Sarah Chen had prepared me for this possibility. "Dorothy, engaging with this kind of public attack will only make you look defensive and unstable. The people who matter will see through it. The people who don't see through it aren't worth your energy." Instead of responding, I did something that surprised even me. I screenshot the entire conversation and forwarded it to Sarah for my legal files. Then I blocked Michael, Cynthia, and anyone who'd commented supportively on their post. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't just the end of our personal relationship. This was social exile, public humiliation, the destruction of my reputation within our extended family and social circle. I felt like I was drowning in shame, even though intellectually I knew I'd done nothing wrong. The isolation was crushing. For 3 days, I barely left my apartment, barely ate, barely slept. But then Lena knocked on my door with news that changed everything. "Dorothy, I've been doing some research. That social media post your son made? It might actually be illegal." She'd consulted with a lawyer friend who specialized in elder law. Publicly posting lies about someone's mental state, especially with the intent to damage their reputation and potentially pursue guardianship, could constitute defamation and elder abuse under New York law. More importantly, the post had actually backfired in ways Michael hadn't expected. Several family members had reached out to Lena privately, expressing skepticism about Michael's version of events. They remembered the Michael who'd always been spoiled and demanding, who'd borrowed money from various relatives over the years and rarely paid it back. "Your cousin Patricia called me," Lena reported. "She said Michael tried to get money from her last year, claimed it was for Emma's surgery. But she saw pictures of them in Europe a week later. She's been wondering how they could afford international travel if they were struggling financially." Patricia wasn't the only one who'd started connecting dots. Robert's brother James had lent Michael money for emergency car repairs and later seen him driving a brand new BMW. My sister Eleanor remembered being asked for Christmas money for the children, only to hear later that the family had spent the holidays at an expensive resort. Michael and Cynthia's pattern of manipulating family members for money was apparently well established. I'd just been the most reliable source, the one who never said no, never asked uncomfortable questions. The family members who truly mattered were already reaching out, not to criticize my choices but to express concern about how I'd been treated. They could see through Michael's manipulation because they'd experienced it themselves in smaller ways. But the most important realization was this: I didn't need their approval or understanding to know I'd made the right choice. For the first time in my life, my decision wasn't based on fear of what others would think, but on respect for my own worth and dignity. I spent that evening writing in a journal Sarah had suggested I keep, documenting not just the facts of my situation but my feelings about it. The words flowed like water from a broken dam. I am not a bad mother for refusing to enable my son's irresponsible behavior. I am not a selfish grandmother for protecting the resources I'll need to maintain my independence. I am not mentally incompetent for recognizing manipulation and refusing to participate in it. Writing those words felt like a form of prayer, a declaration of independence from years of self-doubt and emotional manipulation. That night, for the first time since Christmas, I slept through the night without nightmares about dying alone and unloved. I was learning that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely, and that peace of mind was worth more than purchased affection. But my family had one more test waiting for me, one final attempt to break my resolve and drag me back into their web of financial dependence and emotional manipulation. If you're still listening to this story, if you're recognizing patterns in your own life or feeling inspired by my journey toward self-respect, please know that the hardest part was still ahead. Sometimes the people who claim to love us will push us to our absolute breaking point before they finally accept that we're serious about change. But here's what I was learning: every time I stood firm, every time I refused to back down, I became a little bit stronger. And strength, once you find it, becomes easier to access the next time you need it. March brought an unexpected visitor to my door, not Michael or Cynthia, but my granddaughter Emma. She stood in the hallway of my apartment building, looking small and uncertain, with tears streaming down her 11-year-old face. "Grandma? Can I come in?" I walked here from the subway. My heart nearly stopped. Emma lived an hour away by train, and she'd somehow navigated the New York subway system alone to reach my apartment. The danger she'd put herself in, the desperation that must have driven her to such lengths, it was almost more than I could bear. I pulled her inside, wrapped her in a blanket, and made hot chocolate while trying to hide my panic. "Emma, sweetheart, how did you get here? Do your parents know where you are?" Through her tears, the story tumbled out. Michael and Cynthia had been fighting constantly since Christmas, their arguments growing louder and more vicious each week. The financial pressure I'd refused to relieve was taking its toll on their marriage, and they were taking their frustration out on each other and their children. "They keep saying it's your fault, Grandma. That you ruined our family because you're selfish and mean. But I don't understand why wanting to keep your own money makes you selfish. And you were never mean to me." Emma's innocent questions cut straight to the heart of the manipulation I'd been subjected to for years. An 11-year-old could see the logical flaws in her parents' reasoning, the unfairness of blaming me for problems I hadn't created. "I miss you, Grandma. I miss coming here and baking cookies and watching old movies. I miss having someone who listened to me instead of just arguing all the time." I held her close, breathing in her familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. This was the moment Michael and Cynthia had been waiting for, the emotional leverage that would force me to capitulate, to choose my grandchildren's immediate happiness over my own long-term well-being. But I'd learned something important over the past few months. Rescuing Emma from her parents' dysfunction wouldn't actually help her, it would only enable their behavior to continue, creating an endless cycle where my grandchildren learned that love could be bought and sold, that manipulation was an acceptable way to solve problems. "Emma," I said carefully, "I love you more than you'll ever know. But the problems between your parents and me aren't something a little girl should have to worry about. These are adult issues that adults need to solve. But if you just gave them the money they need, everything would go back to normal, she said, repeating what she'd obviously been told at home. Sweetheart, giving your parents money won't solve their real problems. It would only make those problems bigger. Sometimes people need to learn to solve their own difficulties instead of expecting others to rescue them. I called Michael to let him know Emma was safe, enduring a barrage of accusations and threats. He was furious that she'd run away, but even more furious that I wasn't using the opportunity to negotiate my surrender. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" he shouted over the phone. "To traumatize my daughter, to make her feel like her own grandmother doesn't care about her." "Michael, I care about Emma more than you can possibly imagine. That's exactly why I won't enable behavior that's ultimately harmful to your entire family." When Michael and Cynthia arrived to collect Emma an hour later, their faces were masks of cold fury. They barely spoke to me, treating me like a kidnapper rather than the grandmother who'd protected their daughter and called them immediately. But Emma hugged me tightly before leaving, whispering in my ear, "I still love you, Grandma. Even if they say I'm not supposed to." That whispered declaration of love would sustain me through the dark weeks that followed. Because Michael and Cynthia weren't finished with their campaign to break me. If emotional manipulation wouldn't work, if public humiliation hadn't succeeded, they were prepared to escalate to legal intimidation. 2 weeks later, I received an official-looking letter from a law firm I'd never heard of. My hands shook as I opened it, fearing they were actually pursuing guardianship proceedings to take control of my finances. Instead, it was a cease and desist letter, claiming I was harassing Michael's family, interfering with their parenting, and causing emotional distress to their children. The letter demanded I stop all contact with Emma and Jake, cease any attempts to alienate the children from their parents, and warned that further violations would result in a restraining order. The accusations were so absurd they would have been laughable if they weren't so vicious. I was the one being harassed, the one whose boundaries were being violated. Emma had come to me seeking comfort from the chaos her parents had created, yet somehow I was the one being painted as the threat to family harmony. Sarah Chen reviewed the letter and immediately identified it as an intimidation tactic. "Dorothy, this isn't from a real law firm. The letterhead is fake, the legal language is incorrect, and no legitimate attorney would make these kinds of baseless threats without actual evidence of wrongdoing." Michael had created a fake legal document to frighten me into compliance, a level of deception that revealed just how desperate he'd become, and how far he was willing to go to maintain control over me. But instead of feeling intimidated, I felt strangely liberated. This transparent lie, this obvious attempt at fraud, finally showed me exactly who my son had become. Any remaining doubt about the righteousness of my position evaporated completely. I was dealing with people who would lie to children, manipulate elderly relatives, create false legal documents, and traumatize their own daughter rather than examine their behavior and take responsibility for their choices. There was no reasoning with such people. There was no compromise possible with individuals who saw nothing wrong with financial abuse, emotional blackmail, and outright fraud. The only winning move was not to play their game at all. That evening, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine and the fake legal letter on my coffee table. For the first time since this ordeal began, I actually laughed. The situation was so absurd, the manipulation so transparent, that I couldn't help but see the dark humor in it. Here I was, an 87-year-old woman who'd raised 2 children, survived the death of her husband, and maintained her independence in one of the most expensive cities in the world. And I was supposed to be intimidated by a badly formatted fake legal document? I called Lena, and she came downstairs to celebrate with me. We toasted my freedom from fear, my liberation from the endless anxiety of waiting for the next crisis, the next demand, the next threat. "Dorothy," Lena said, raising her wine glass, "you've done something remarkable. You've chosen self-respect over convenience, dignity over fake peace. Not many people have that kind of courage." But the truly remarkable thing was still to come. Because when you stop participating in dysfunctional family dynamics, when you refuse to enable harmful behavior, sometimes the dysfunction turns on itself in unexpected ways. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people who seemed lost to manipulation find their own way back to sanity. Are you ready to hear how this story really ends? Because what happened next surprised everyone, including me. Sometimes when you stop trying to control other people's choices, they finally have to face the consequences of those choices themselves. April brought news that changed everything, though not in the way I'd expected. The information came through Patricia, my cousin who'd started questioning Michael's financial sob stories after I'd shared my experiences with her. Michael and Cynthia were getting divorced. The financial pressure of living beyond their means, combined with the stress of losing their most reliable source of bailout money, had finally destroyed their marriage. Without my interventions to smooth over their crises, they'd been forced to confront the reality of their situation, and they discovered they didn't like what they saw. The details, as Patricia related them, were both tragic and inevitable. Cynthia had confessed to having an affair with their financial advisor, the same man who'd supposedly given them such terrible investment advice about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. The affair had been going on for over a year, financed in part by the money they'd extracted from me for various emergencies. Michael had finally seen their credit card statements in full, discovering luxury purchases he'd known nothing about, spa retreats and shopping sprees that Cynthia had hidden from him. The $80,000 in debt I'd refused to cover was just the tip of the iceberg. They owed over $200,000 to various creditors. Their house was indeed in foreclosure, but not because of failed investments or unexpected medical bills. It was because they'd refinanced multiple times to fund their extravagant lifestyle, turning their home into a piggy bank they'd systematically emptied. The private school tuition for the children, the expensive cars, the country club membership, the family vacations, all of it had been financed by debt they'd never intended to repay themselves. They'd assumed I would always be there to rescue them when the bills came due. But here's the part of the story that gave me hope for my grandchildren. Michael was apparently beginning to understand what he'd become. Patricia told me he'd called her, not to ask for money, but to apologize for trying to borrow from her under false pretenses. He was working with a bankruptcy attorney, trying to sort through the financial wreckage of his marriage and create a more honest life for himself and his children. He asked about you, Patricia reported carefully. He wanted to know if you were okay, if you needed anything. I think he's starting to realize what he put you through. I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing this news. Relief that the children would be free from the toxic dynamic between their parents. Sadness that it had taken something this devastating to wake Michael up to reality. And yes, a small spark of hope that perhaps the son I'd raised might still exist somewhere beneath the manipulative stranger he'd become. But I wasn't ready to rush back into a relationship with him. I'd learned too much about the importance of boundaries, about protecting my own well-being, to simply forgive and forget because he was finally facing consequences. Instead, I focused on the life I was building for myself. Spring in Manhattan has a special kind of magic, and I was experiencing it fully for the first time in years. I could walk through Central Park without constantly checking my phone for crisis calls. I could make plans for my day without worrying about who might need emergency financial assistance. I'd joined a pottery class at a community center in the village, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was managing everyone else's problems. My hands, which had trembled with anxiety for so many months, were learning to shape clay into vessels, imperfect but beautiful, functional but artistic. There was something deeply therapeutic about working with clay, about creating something beautiful from formless earth. The pottery wheel required patience, attention, and acceptance of imperfection, qualities I was cultivating in my own life as well. My instructor, a patient woman named Maria who'd been throwing pottery for 30 years, often talked about how the clay had to be centered before you could shape it into anything useful. If the clay isn't centered, she'd explain, it will wobble and eventually collapse no matter how skilled you are. But once it's centered, once it's balanced, you can create almost anything. I was finally learning to center myself, to find that balance between caring for others and protecting my own well-being. It had taken 87 years and a devastating family crisis, but I was discovering who Dorothy Peterson was when she wasn't defined by other people's needs and crises. Lena and I had become genuine friends, not just cordial neighbors. We took walks through different neighborhoods, exploring parts of the city I'd never seen despite living here most of my life. We attended free concerts in the park, visited museums on senior discount days, discovered little cafes where the owners treated elderly customers with genuine warmth and respect. I was creating the kind of rich, independent life I'd always assumed was impossible for someone my age. I was proving to myself that vitality and purpose didn't require constant crisis and drama. But I also maintained a space in my heart for reconciliation, if it came on healthy terms. I wasn't bitter towards Michael, even after everything he'd put me through. I understood that addiction, whether to drugs, alcohol, or other people's money, could turn basically good people into strangers. If he was truly committed to building a healthier life, if he was ready to take responsibility for his choices, then perhaps we could find a way back to each other. But it would have to be a relationship between equals, based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. The test of his sincerity would come soon enough. Because sometimes, when people lose everything they thought mattered, they discover what actually does matter. And sometimes, just sometimes, that discovery leads them back to the people they'd taken for granted, ready to appreciate them in ways they never could before. Have you ever wondered what real forgiveness looks like? Not the kind where you pretend nothing happened, but the kind where you acknowledge the harm while remaining open to genuine change? That's what I was learning to practice, and it would soon be put to the ultimate test. The call came on a rainy Thursday evening in May. I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and I'd grown cautious about unexpected phone calls after months of harassment from Michael and Cynthia. But something made me pick up, perhaps intuition or simple curiosity. "Hello, Mrs. Peterson? This is Sarah Martinez from Mercy General Hospital. I have your son Michael here, and he's asking to speak with you." My blood froze. Hospital. Michael injured or sick, alone and asking for me. Every maternal instinct I'd been suppressing for months roared back to life. "Is he okay? What happened?" "He's stable, ma'am. He was in a car accident, not serious injuries, but he needs someone to pick him up. He says his wife, his ex-wife, isn't available, and he doesn't have anyone else to call." No one else to call. The man who'd threatened to cut me off from the family, who'd publicly humiliated me, who'd tried to intimidate me with fake legal documents, he had no one else to turn to in his moment of need. I could have hung up. I could have told the nurse that Michael had made his choices and would have to live with the consequences. I would have been completely justified in leaving him to figure out his own way home from the hospital. But I didn't. Not because I was weak or because I hadn't learned anything from our painful months of separation. I went because I was strong enough to help without expectation, to show compassion without surrendering my boundaries. I took a taxi to the hospital, something I would have considered an unaffordable luxury during the years I was bankrolling Michael's lifestyle. Now I could spend $20 on cab fare without anxiety because I wasn't supporting two households with my limited income. I found Michael in the emergency room, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd seen him since childhood. His left arm was in a sling, there were bruises on his face, and his expensive clothes were torn and dirty. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears, not the manipulative tears I'd learned to recognize, but genuine emotion born of relief and shame. "Mom, you came," he whispered. "Of course I came. You're hurt and you needed help." We didn't talk much during the taxi ride to his temporary apartment, a modest place in Queens, a dramatic downgrade from the Long Island house he'd lost to foreclosure. The silence wasn't hostile, but it was careful, uncertain. At his building, Michael turned to me with words I'd been waiting months to hear. "Mom, I owe you an apology. More than an apology, I owe you amends for what I put you through." I waited, saying nothing. I'd learned the importance of letting people finish their thoughts without rushing to make them comfortable. "I've been going to therapy," he continued. "Court-ordered at first, because of the divorce, but I kept going because I was starting to see things about myself I didn't want to acknowledge." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I used you, Mom. I treated you like an ATM instead of a person. I manipulated your love for me and turned it into a weapon against you. I involved my children in adult financial problems and taught them that love could be bought and sold." The words hung in the humid night air between us. This was the conversation I'd dreamed of having, the acknowledgement I'd needed to hear. But now that it was happening, I found myself more interested in his future choices than in relitigating past hurts. "What are you going to do differently?" I asked simply. "I'm learning to live within my means, for starters. This apartment costs a third of what the house did, and I can actually afford it on my salary. Emma and Jake are in public school now, and you know what? They're doing fine. Better than fine, they seem less anxious without the pressure of maintaining appearances." He talked about his job, the same marketing position he'd had all along, which paid a decent middle-class salary but couldn't support the luxury lifestyle he'd felt entitled to. He talked about shared custody arrangements with Cynthia, about learning to co-parent without the financial stress that had poisoned their marriage. Most importantly, he talked about wanting to rebuild our relationship on honest terms. "I know I destroyed your trust, and I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough. I have to show you through my actions that I've changed. I don't want anything from you except the chance to prove I can be a son you're proud of again." I looked at this man, my son, but also a stranger I was just beginning to meet. The arrogant entitlement was gone, replaced by humility that seemed genuine. The desperate edge of financial panic had been replaced by something like peace. "Michael," I said carefully, "I'm glad you're getting help. I'm glad you're learning to take responsibility for your choices. But I need you to understand something, our relationship can't go back to the way it was. I won't be rescuing you from crises anymore, because that wasn't healthy for either of us." He nodded, tears still flowing. "I understand. I don't want you to rescue me anymore. I want to be someone you can respect, someone you can be proud to call your son." We agreed to start slowly. Coffee once a week, with the understanding that I wouldn't discuss his financial situation and he wouldn't ask for money. We'd talk about books, about his children, about my pottery classes and his therapy sessions. It would take time to rebuild trust. It would take consistent proof that his change was real and lasting. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the possibility of having a genuine relationship with my son. As I rode home in another taxi, looking out at the city lights that had witnessed so much pain and transformation over the past year, I reflected on everything I'd learned. Love without boundaries isn't really love, it's enabling. Helping people without requiring them to take responsibility for their choices ultimately hurts everyone involved. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to face their problems alone, to discover their own strength and resilience. I had learned to value myself not just as a mother and grandmother, but as Dorothy Peterson, a complete person worthy of respect and kindness. I had discovered that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely, that peace of mind was more valuable than purchased affection. Most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to change the patterns that no longer serve you. Even at 87, even after decades of people-pleasing and self-sacrifice, I had found the courage to stand up for myself. But this story doesn't end with Michael's apology, because real change is measured in actions, not words. The true test would be whether he could maintain his new perspective when life inevitably brought new challenges. Are you wondering if this reconciliation lasted? If Michael truly had changed, or if this was just another form of manipulation designed to draw me back into his web? I wondered the same thing. Because I'd learned that people can change, but they can also revert to old patterns when the pressure builds. The answer would come sooner than I expected, in a way that would test both of our commitments to this new, healthier dynamic. 6 months after that night at the hospital, Michael faced his biggest challenge yet. Emma, now 12 and dealing with the emotional aftermath of her parents' divorce, was struggling in school and acting out at home. The girl who'd once been my baking partner had become withdrawn and angry, caught between two parents who were still learning how to prioritize their children's needs over their own conflicts. In the old days, Michael's first call would have been to me, not for emotional support or parenting advice, but for money to solve the problem. Private tutoring, therapy, maybe even a change to a more expensive school that he thought would fix everything. Instead, he called me to talk. "Mom, I don't know what to do about Emma. She's so angry all the time, and I feel like I'm failing her. Cynthia and I can't agree on anything, and Emma is paying the price for our mistakes." I listened as he talked through his options, his fears, his guilt about the disruption he'd caused in his daughter's life. What struck me most was that he wasn't looking for me to solve the problem, he was processing it out loud with someone who cared about both him and Emma. "Have you considered family therapy?" I suggested. "Not just for Emma, but for all of you to learn better ways of communicating?" "I can't afford private therapy for everyone," he admitted. "But there's a community mental health center that offers sliding scale fees based on income." I was thinking about looking into that. This was the Michael I'd raised, resourceful, thoughtful, willing to do hard work instead of looking for easy solutions. He was facing his problems head-on instead of expecting someone else to rescue him. Over the following months, I watched him navigate single parenthood with a grace I'd never seen before. He learned to cook simple meals instead of relying on expensive takeout. He found free activities to do with his children, library story hours, free museum days, walks in Prospect Park. Most importantly, he was teaching Emma and Jake lessons about resilience, about making the best of difficult situations, about finding joy in connection that didn't depend on material possessions or social status. Emma gradually began visiting me again, but the dynamic was completely different. Instead of the strained, supervised visits of the past, these were organic connections. She'd stop by after school sometimes, wanting to talk about books or help me with my pottery projects. She told me about her new school, how different it was from her old private school, but how she'd made friends there who weren't obsessed with designer clothes and expensive vacations. She talked about her parents' divorce with the wisdom of a child who'd been allowed to process her feelings instead of being used as a pawn in adult conflicts. "Grandma," she said one afternoon as we worked clay together, "I'm sorry about what happened before. When I came here crying and asking you to give Mom and Dad money, I didn't understand that you were trying to help us by not helping us." The maturity in her voice amazed me. At 12, she was already learning lessons about boundaries and consequences that many adults never master. "Emma, you were just a child caught in a difficult situation. You don't have anything to apologize for." "But I do want to understand," she persisted. "Why was it better for you to say no to us?" I chose my words carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer without criticizing her parents. Sometimes when we rescue people from their problems, we prevent them from learning how to solve those problems themselves. "Your dad is much stronger and more capable than he was before, because he had to learn to depend on himself instead of depending on me." She nodded thoughtfully. "Like when you taught me to ride a bike and you had to let go of the seat even though I was scared?" "Exactly like that." These conversations with Emma gave me hope not just for our immediate family, but for the lessons she was learning about healthy relationships, about self-respect and mutual respect. Michael continued to demonstrate his growth in small ways that meant more to me than grand gestures ever could. He remembered my birthday with a card he'd made himself and a promise to take me to dinner at a modest restaurant we could both afford. He called just to check in, with no agenda other than connecting with me as a person. When I had a minor medical scare, chest pains that turned out to be anxiety rather than anything serious. He came to the emergency room and sat with me for hours without once suggesting that I should move in with him or give up my independence. Most tellingly, when he got a small promotion at work that included a modest raise, his first impulse wasn't to upgrade his lifestyle but to put the extra money toward paying down his remaining debts. "I want to be completely debt-free within 2 years," he told me proudly. "I never want to be in a position again where I'm desperate enough to hurt the people I love." A year after our reconciliation began, Michael invited me to his apartment for a home-cooked dinner, the first meal he'd prepared entirely himself, he said with mock pride. The apartment was small but cozy, decorated with things he and the children had made rather than expensive purchases. Emma and Jake helped serve dinner, and I could see how much more relaxed and natural they seemed in this simpler environment. There was laughter around the table, genuine conversation, the kind of family warmth that can't be bought with money. After dinner, as the children did homework at the kitchen table and Michael and I cleaned dishes together, he said something that made me realize our healing was complete. "Mom, I know I can never really make up for the years I wasted, the pain I caused you. But I want you to know that losing your respect was the wake-up call I needed to become the person I should have been all along. Michael, you didn't lose my respect permanently. You lost my willingness to enable behavior that was hurting both of us. There's a difference." He smiled, and for the first time in years, I saw the sweet boy he'd been before entitlement and fear had twisted him into someone I barely recognized. "I'm glad you were strong enough to say no to me, Mom. I'm glad you loved me enough to let me face the consequences of my choices." As I rode the subway home that night, I reflected on the strange journey we'd all taken. A family crisis that had felt like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something much better. We'd all learned lessons we couldn't have learned any other way. I had learned to value myself as a complete person, not just a resource for others to exploit. Michael had learned to take responsibility for his choices and to find strength in adversity rather than in other people's wallets. Emma and Jake had learned that love isn't transactional, that real security comes from family bonds built on respect rather than financial dependency. But perhaps the most important lesson was this: sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's dysfunction. Sometimes saying no is the greatest act of compassion possible. If you're listening to my story and recognizing yourself in it, if you're being taken advantage of by family members who see you as an endless source of bailouts and resources, I want you to know that it's never too late to change the dynamic. It won't be easy. There will be guilt, fear, loneliness, and doubt. People accustomed to your enablement will fight hard to maintain the status quo. They'll try emotional blackmail, public humiliation, threats, and manipulation. But on the other side of that difficulty lies something precious: self-respect, genuine relationships, and the knowledge that you're strong enough to stand up for yourself even when it costs you something. You are worth more than what you can provide to others. Your value doesn't depend on your willingness to sacrifice your own well-being for people who take your love for granted. You deserve to be seen as a complete human being worthy of respect and consideration. Have you ever been in a situation where family members treated you more like an ATM than a person? Have you struggled with the decision to help versus enabling? I'd love to hear your story, because I know I'm not the only one who's faced these difficult choices. Please share your experiences in the comments below. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these struggles gives us the courage to make the changes we need to make. And if this story has touched you in any way, if it's helped you think about your own relationships differently, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. Sharing these difficult truths is how we help each other heal and grow. Remember, it's never too late to rewrite your story. It's never too late to demand the respect you deserve. And it's never too late to discover who you are when you're not defined by other people's needs and crises. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for allowing me to open my heart to you. And remember, you are stronger than you know, more valuable than you believe, and deserving of love that doesn't come with a price tag attached. Your story is still being written. Make sure you're the author, not just a character in someone else's drama.